In this clip, we will add an API. We're looking at the API blade. What we want to add is an HTTP API. So let's click the button for that. Let's say that this API will be linked to our travel inspiration endpoints that are still on the app service. So I'm going to name this one Travel Inspiration App Service Endpoints. The web service URL is the URL that points to the backend, so our app service URL. And then I can choose an API URI suffix, which will be added to the base URL of this API. Let's say Travel Inspiration App Service. Typically in real life, I would choose other naming for this, as this is the URI that will be exposed to the outside world. And for the outside world, it's of course of no importance where the backend API is effectively hosted. They don't need to know that it's hosted on an app service. But for the demo, I'm going to use this naming as it will allow us to easily identify an API that talks to an app service in the backend and another one that will integrate with a function later on. So this is just for demo purposes. All right, that's it already. If we click full, there's a few more things we can fill out, but we have no need for that at the moment. So I'm simply going to leave this as is. Let's click create. And on the left here, we see our API. All right, now it's time to add some operations to it. And let me make the screen a little bit bigger. The operations we can define here are the endpoints we want to expose via this APIM API. Let's say we want to define an endpoint for searching destinations. Let's click Add Operation. Now let me input search destinations. Important here is that the URL defines how this API endpoint will be exposed to the outside world via APIM. But next to that, it also tells APIM where it can find the resource in the downstream API, so in the backend API. In other words, in our app service. So by default, they must match. So I have to put this to /API/destinations. Now, this won't always be what you need. Luckily, it's just a default. We can change this by using a policy, but more on that later. Right, let me add a description as well. Search for destinations, let's say. And if I remember correctly, the destinations endpoint allows us to pass through a search for query string value. So I want to define that here as well. I choose query and I choose to add a parameter. We give it search for as name. And let's give it a description as well. And it's of type string. Likewise, you can add URL template parameters, headers, and response status codes. You can't define things related to the request body because this is a GET request and request bodies of GET requests are ignored. If this was a POST request, you would be able to define a request body description here. The more specific you are here, the easier it will become for people that need to integrate with your API to know how they should do that. So in a real-life situation, I'd advise you to be as specific as possible here, just like I did when we defined an OpenAPI operation, so the Swagger specification for our function endpoints. Doing that really helps the people that need to integrate with your API, and that means less work for the help desk, less people bothering you asking how to integrate with the API. All right, let's save this. And here's our search destination endpoint. What we get here is a nice view of how a request will flow. Front end here is what's on the gateway. So /API/destinations. That's the endpoint with a potential search for query string parameter. Then we can do inbound processing. We can change what comes in. In other words, we can modify the request, and the way to do that is by using policies. Rewriting the URL to the backend would be something you could do here. Then the backend is called, so this is our app service endpoint. When the backend responds, we can modify the response with outbound processing, and afterwards the response is returned to the caller. To test this, we can use the Test tab here. We can fill out a search for value. It's optional. I'm not going to do that now. We can add headers. We see the request URL that will be executed. We see how the HTTP request will look. So let me just click send and then see what happens. And there we go. We get back a 200 OK response. And this is effectively coming from the backend API endpoint. So we can now call our API through API management. A few typical things to do now would be adding policies, for example, for rate limiting. Another thing we could do is ensure that the endpoints can only be called via APIM and no longer directly via the app service endpoint URI. I'll show you how to do both, but we have a few other things to tackle first. Manually adding an API works, but it is cumbersome. It's easy enough to do for 1 or 2 APIs or endpoints, but it's rather annoying once you have tens or hundreds of endpoints. There's another way. Importing an API. Let's do that next. We have another few API endpoints deployed, the ones that are exposed via our function app. As you remember, the function app exposes an OpenAPI document via the Swagger endpoint. So yeah, you kinda got me. I had an additional motive when I showed you how to integrate OpenAPI with an Azure function in the previous section. Let's fetch that OpenAPI definition. Of course, I can't fetch it manually anymore, because no matter which endpoint I try to execute here, let me just try one, I'm getting a permission denied, because that's how we set it up in the previous section. But in the previous section, we also learned how to get a token that will give us access. I've opened PowerShell and I'm logged in to the Azure CLI. With AZ account, get access token, followed by resource equals https management.azure.com. I'm getting an access token that will grant me access. Now let's get the URI of the Swagger definition file. That is the rendered Swagger document URI. So let's get that one. It's going to be swagger.json. And now we need to send the GET request, including our bearer token. I'm going to use the HTTP file from Visual Studio to send the request. So that's a GET request to the swagger.json endpoint. I want to accept JSON, and as authorization header value, I pass through bearer, followed by the token. Let me copy that and paste it here, and let's send the request. Great, here's our Swagger definition of our API endpoints at level of the function app. Let me copy this. And let me store that in a JSON file. I'll store it in my Dome train folder. Demo swagger.json, let's say. All right. So far for that. Back to the portal. Let's choose to add an API. And this time I'm going to choose to create the API from a definition file. We've got a Swagger definition file, in other words, an OpenAPI definition. So that's what we choose. And I select it. Here's the demo swagger.json file, and it already parsed it. The display name, Travel Inspiration Function App Endpoints, including the typo I apparently made. Well, this is already coming from the Swagger file. Let's add Travel Inspiration Function App as suffix, and let's click Create. And we seem to hit a parsing error. Apparently our OpenAPI definition file isn't completely valid. This is a bit of a mismatch between the OpenAPI package we used in our function app code to generate the OpenAPI definition and the schema validation that goes on. Fact is that indeed our OpenAPI definition is missing a required field. So what was generated by the Azure package wasn't completely correct. But it's easy enough to fix. Here's that Swagger definition file again. What's missing is the version. This is a required field. So let's set that to v1, for example. Let's save this again. And let's select this again. There we go. And now let's click Create. All right, here's our second API. It has been generated from our OpenAPI definition file. Let's test this, for example, by sending a request to get the itineraries. So let me select that operation, choose test, and let's send. And we get back a 401 unauthorized. That kind of makes sense. Our function app, which is the downstream API endpoint that is being called, expects a token and we are not providing that. At least not yet. We will fix this soon. But first, let's look at the level above the APIs we have just defined. Products, and related to that, subscriptions.